Hello, gang. Back again to pick up where we left off last time in my collecting backstory. That was at the end of 2014-ish. I had been like a kid in a candy store buying all kinds of stuff. And I had gotten to a point where I realized something had to give because I had essentially reached capacity, of how much resources I was comfortable allocating to comic books. And so, if I wanted to keep buying some things, I needed to focus in and get rid of some things to give myself some cap room to pursue what I really wanted to pursue. And so to do that, I had to do some soul searching to figure out what was my real true love in terms of collecting. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, and as you might infer from my YouTube channel name, EC Comics became that thing where I decided that's going to be my main collecting passion. It doesn't mean I don't love the other stuff, right? I still love and appreciate the Silver Age heroes, of course, but I can love and appreciate them without collecting them, particularly in a completist fashion. Because I must say my natural bent is toward being a completist type. And so ECs I decided were the thing. And based on that completist tendency, I further decided, if I'm going to streamline and get rid of some of these other strands, I'm going to go for EC completion. I think in a subsequent video, I'll tell you how I sort of parameterized the starting and ending points and what I include in that set. But I decided it was going to be EC for me as priority number one. And at that point, I had over 100 plus EC comics at that point, because I had been buying ECs along this last 2 years, along with the other hero type stuff. So I had a good start. But when I decided, I need to narrow things down, EC rose to the top. Now, why is that? So, like I say, it was a soul-searching effort. So I'm just in no particular cohesive fashion. I'll mention a few things that, when all added together, wound up making ECs kind of the natural thing for me to focus on. So one of the things that has led me to full-blown EC fan addiction is my man, Jack Davis, right? There's my man, Jack. So Jack, as it turns out, right, when I was a kid collecting Mad magazines, I was sort of unaware of all the other cool stuff that Jack was doing in the other titles, in particular in the horror stuff, right? I was unaware of all the other EC stuff, but I knew Jack Davis was doing awesome stuff within the pages of Mad Magazine, and also he was doing incredible stuff as an artist for the University of Georgia Bulldogs. So I mentioned I grew up in Georgia. Turns out I grew up in a small town in Georgia, about 20 minutes away from Athens, Georgia, which is the home of the University of Georgia. UGA is my alma mater. It's where I went to undergrad. Well, guess who else grew up in Georgia? And guess who else went to UGA? My man, JD. So, we're practically related at that point, right? But Jack, back in the late 70s and the 80s, he was doing the UGA artwork for the UGA Bulldogs. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this artwork. Let me see if my technology will cooperate with me. Right? He was doing this kind of stuff. And I had Jack Davis posters of Harry Dog, basically, because I was a UGA fan as a kid, right? It was just right down the road. So I had artwork of Jack Davis all over my room. It happened to be, Harry Dog. But now, all these years later, as I consider, Jack Davis's broader sort of work for EC, it's amazing how much Harry Dog, if you stripped all his equipment off, how much Harry resembles like a Jack Davis werewolf, for example, from Tales from the Crypt. You have to use your imagination a bit. But all these years later, it occurs to me that one of the main reasons that Jack Davis really resonates with me is because as a kid, I was surrounded by his artwork, which basically had nothing to do with EC. But now that I consider his broader EC portfolio, it's just everything starts resonating. So that's awesome. So another thing, I guess, so I guess that's item number one, is this sort of connection I had with Jack Davis. So from 2012 to 2014, as I was getting back into the comic scene and educating myself, researching a few things here and there, like I mentioned before, I started reading more I got interested in the censorship movement. And I started reading about the comic censorship movement in the 50s. Turns out that EC was front and center in the censorship movement. And you can read those stories for yourself. I'll just hit a few of the highlights, but I'll come back to that in just a moment. So EC has a fascinating history. I started reading more about that history all the way back to the formation of EC and Max Gaines. A lot of people start thinking about EC in the era of Bill Gaines, but Max Gaines, Bill's father, founded EC in 1945, I think. So Max Gaines, right, was a pioneer in the comics industry. There's old Max, right? He was pretty heavily involved in the formation of comics as we know them. He was involved with his company, All American Publications, I can't remember, I think it started in the late 30s, but he was involved in a company called All American Publications and was tightly integrated with DC Comics at the time. I'll talk some more about that history probably in another video, but Max basically founded EC as Educational Comics in 1945. And at that time, I think it's fair to say Max had very little interest in the superhero genre. He was interested, actually, when he started EC in 45. He was interested, seems to me, in educating people through comic books. Like, he was interested in comic books that had educational themes. And in fact, he branded EC, when he created it, as Educational Comics. It would be Bill Gaines later who transformed EC from educational comics to entertaining comics. But when Max sort of parted ways with DC and started EC, he founded EC with a series of promotional comic books that, generally speaking, had educational themes. Like, there were a few promotional comics that EC did for the Lutheran Church, the Department of Education of the American Museum of Natural History. So there were some promo comics and a series of picture stories comics. The key title that he launched EC with was called Picture Stories from the Bible. But he did a bunch of stuff. There was picture stories from science, picture stories from world history, picture stories from American history. Here's one of my copies of Picture Stories from American History, number 2. This is a Gaines file copy, actually. So, and there you see, right, EC was known as an educational comic. Now, I mentioned in one of my previous videos that I'm an educator. I'm a college professor. So this history of EC with being founded as an educational comic, really resonates with me. So that's another reason EC really resonates with me. So we've got my man JD. We've got the educational origins of EC. And so I've already now got multiple layers of interests being satisfied within this one publisher. But there's more than that. Right? Now, let's talk a bit about Bill Gaines. So Bill Gaines, what to say about him other than he's the man, right? Bill. Turns out Bill was on the path to being an educator himself. So he had enrolled in NYU. I believe he was studying to be a chemistry teacher. I suppose maybe influenced by his father's own passion for education. So Bill was on the path to being a chemistry teacher, and then his father, Max, who was running EC, gets killed in a boating accident. So you can read about that history, but Max gets killed in a boating accident. I think Bill was a junior in college at the time. And so Bill winds up sort of, like a good son, I suppose, takes over the family business, EC Comics. And then Bill decides he's going to shake things up, get rid of this educational stuff, focus on some stuff he thought would be a bit more profitable and interesting, I suppose, to the consumers of the day. So he rebrands EC as Entertaining Comics and proceeds to hire what I would consider to be some of the best artists in the industry at the time. And one of the things that was really different is he unleashed them and turned them loose and gave them a lot of freedom to exercise their own creativity. And I may be biased. Different people have different opinions, right? But I sincerely think that the EC comics of the early 50s generated some of the best comic art and the most intelligent stories that in comic history, basically. Well, one problem, though, was that Congress didn't agree with my sentiment. And so again, this brings me, I guess, to one of the other important layers of my fascination with EC Comics. Like I mentioned, I just find the whole censorship movement in the 50s with respect to comics fascinating. Like I mentioned, I even went through a Seduction of the Innocent collecting phase based off that interest. But it turns out, EC was front and center in this whole censorship issue. And in fact, it was this censorship issue, the censorship movement in the 50s that led to essentially the demise of EC Comics, which led Bill to sort of focus exclusively on Mad Magazine, which then Mad Magazine, after 1956, 1957, Mad was all there was basically to EC. The censorship movement killed them. Just to show you a little bit more eye candy, this book was front and center, right, in this whole situation. Bill got himself in a little bit of trouble in I think a Senate hearing in the way that Bill talked about this particular book, Crime Suspense Stories 22. So that book was instrumental. So now we've got like several different layers, of EC that satisfy so many touch points with me. Jack Davis, those feelings resonating from childhood, Mad Magazine, that sort of foundation from childhood, the educational origins of EC, right? The stories, the quality of the art, and the stories themselves, and the connection to the censorship situation is just so many. So EC gives me an outlet that covers so many touch points. It's EC for me, again, as priority number one. So I'm an EC completist now. In another video, I'll talk to you about what that actually means. Like, where does it start and end? How did I figure out what all to include in that? Okay, so having made that decision, then I started pursuing more ECs. And I did this in sort of an iterative fashion, right? I would buy more ECs, and then I'd be like, okay, I need cap room. What am I going to trim off from this other assortment of collecting strands? What's going to hit the chopping block next? I did it sort of in an iterative fashion. The first thing I decided was, after now being back in this game a couple of years, I found it more appealing to get closer to the origins of the heroes and closer to the origins of comics, rather than, I found that more satisfying than pursuing, the things that were on the stands when I was a child, which meant Bronze Age was the first thing to fall, right? Let me just get rid of anything Bronze Age so I can now winnow down silver, gold, right? So the Bronze Age books hit the chopping block. And then, do I really need the shark covers? No. Next thing to go. Do I need the chalkboard covers? No. So all these tangential themes, the Seduction of the Innocent books, no. That's gonna go. The EC books are gonna cover that desire, right? EC had enough to do with censorship. I can let the SOTY books go. So on and on and on. So then the next things that started falling, I'm buying more ECs. And then I started having to make the hard decisions about the Silver Age superhero titles, right? Okay, X-Men, I'm going to let X-Men go. Now I'm going to let Fantastic Four go, right? Now, okay, I'm to a point, I've got to let something else go. Now Daredevil's going to go. I'm buying ECs, right? So as I keep hitting my cap room again, the next hero title hits the chopping block. So that's kind of the way I approached it. Like I said, I realized I can still appreciate those heroes and love them. I don't have to collect them. Fine, right? I'm collecting ECs. So after I went through sort of that iterative process, I ended up getting rid of conceptually. I mean, I still have a lot of these books in my to be sold boxes. So that the actual act of getting them out of my house is still ongoing. I mean, there's no particular rush for that. I'll sort of do that as time permits. But at least in terms of my collecting focus, Silver is out. So I have reduced myself to ECs, Golden Age EC, and that term is a little bit nebulous. Pre-1957 ECs. I don't essentially collect now anything after 1957. So in the same style that some of you guys do, you write things down on the backer boards, just to give you the simple visual. Here in now Ed Owens, now we're in 2018. Here's what I would say I collect. Here's the universe. ECs. And I'm going for EC, the complete publisher, pre-1957. I'll expound on this in a subsequent video, but that's about 470 books. Mad imitator books. So back in the 50s, Mad was the first satire comic book, and it was wildly successful at the time. So a lot of the other publishers, Atlas, Ajax, some others, decided this satire thing seems to be working for EC. Let's launch our own satire titles. So there are about 45 Mad imitator books. I'll do a separate video about those later. I'll talk more about this. So the company that Max had before EC, in the year before he essentially founded EC, he broke from DC and published 48 comic books that had an All-American Publication logo on the cover. Before 1944, 1945, all of Max's books were branded basically with the DC logo. He went through about a year, maybe a little over a year, where he was branding his comic books with his own company's logo. That's about 48 books. I find that particular subset fascinating. Those are like the EC precursors, right? When Max was deciding, what am I going to keep when I go launch my own company? So that's a very interesting period to me. So that's 48 books. Those three items I have decided are going to take care of my completist tendencies. Complete those three groups of books. And then just in a non-completist fashion, I'm going to pursue some motorcycle covers and billiards covers, which I mentioned in my previous video. These are two sort of very important sort of things in the history of my life that I think there's some really cool comic books that feature billiards and motorcycles in particular. There aren't that many billiards covers. I'm just going to pick up billiards and motorcycle covers that I particularly love. I don't have to buy every motorcycle cover from the Golden Age, which, believe me, that temptation was there for a bit. I almost went down that path, and I'm like, let's use this as an exercise to prove to myself that I can collect some things that I enjoy in a non-completist way. So I just pick up motorcycle and billiards covers that I find particularly interesting. So this is my collecting universe. Everything else has fallen by the wayside. I'll continue trying to actually literally get them out. Although I've gotten rid of a lot of those other things that don't fit these categories, but still more to go. And that's basically it. So I guess my next video, I'll start. So I think the next video I'll talk a little bit about when I say I'm an EC completist. What are the boundaries of that? How did I come up with these 470 books? Where does it stop and start? And I guess I'll talk about then what progress have I made, right? How far along am I with respect to the 470? I've made quite a bit of progress. And then I'll probably do some other separate videos talking about and showing you some books from some of these other strands. But this is basically where I am at this point. This is the result of my sort of evolution now, I guess, almost 6 years after I re-engaged in the hobby. So thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.